Did you?
Yeah, I did.
Why'd you do that then?
Because I made such a dick of myself so many times.
Do you still get those? I mean, Gary obviously just asked you why you gave up. Do you get that question a lot?
Yes, I do. People think it's odd. I will drink champagne. I will have a glass or two of champagne because it would be crazy not to. But
and there is a real social expectation that you will. If you're at a party, if you're at an event on Christmas Day, people look at you strangely if you don't drink.
Yeah, they do. But I mean, I'm quite comfortable with it. I mean, I was one of those people who would wake up and have an appalling amount of recall. I said that. Oh, God.
Oh, no. That's,
you know, that stuff.
That feeling.
And I don't like that feeling, so I don't have it anymore.
And you're present in the moment all the time.
Well, yes, but I try not to look censorious.
Gary, will you be having a few drinks on Christmas Day?
I most certainly will. For me, the drinking of a bit of wine and occasional beer, I don't like beer very much, and telling yarns and stories, even though I repeat myself constantly, is actually a very important part of my life. I love it. I love how it brings people together. And in New Zealand, we do drink a lot. But it is actually, there's some really rewarding moments in it. Even when you go to a pub, when you're travelling around New Zealand, as I often do, and you go into the local pub and you have a few drinks with the locals and then you all start telling yarns and things like that. For me, there's a really upside to it. Now, I understand, of course, where the doctors are coming from. What they don't want is people going out in the roads and killing themselves or fighting at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning in Courtney Place. I understand all of that, but would never stand up and say we must stop this drinking thing around New Zealand. That would be ridiculous and would ruin my life, so I'm not going to vote for that.
The NZTA is trying to minimise the stress on doctors, at least in terms of, as you say, drink driving. They've announced an initiative today offering free public transport this Friday in Auckland to ensure people make it home safely. So the Friday before Christmas, one of the worst days of the year for drink driving, according to the police. So you obviously think it's a good idea, Gary?
Yeah, it's a practical idea. Now, I like practical ideas because, you see, in the countryside, when you say to young fellas, who are working on the farm, they go to the pub, don't drink, drive. Well, the pub might be 40 k's away. And it's all very well saying there's no taxi service. So practical things like providing courtesy cars or buses in this case strikes me as being a very useful and valuable and probably very productive thing to do.
Yeah, I'm thinking about not only the alcohol abuse but also the drug abuse with all those extreme and awful new inventive drugs. Far worse than anything else, P and other things with names I can't remember that are initials and what have you. So they seem to have a terrible effect on people and make them very violent and quite crazy.
It seems like a great idea, although I guess one of the things that people would argue is if you're going to a work function on Friday, you possibly could also just not have a drink.
Oh, yeah.
Well, that's that whole unrealistic thing. It's like the marijuana thing, that New Zealand lives in denial over. People will. So therefore, if the workplaces and the staff can get together and sort out courtesy vans and things, that's the way to go.
Here we go. It is coming up to 5 o'clock. Checkpoint is next. Jim Moira will be back tomorrow. My thanks for Gary McCormick and Rosemary McLeod. We're going to end, thanks for your suggestion, Pete, on a song that came up because of the Touching Plants, Carrot Juice and Murder by the Arrogant Worms.
How do you think that feels? Carrot juice constitutes murder. Greenhouses, prisons for slaves. It's time to stop all this gardening. Let's call a spade a spade.
Te whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. You're listening to Checkpoint. I'm Lisa Owen. On tonight's program, spying on your own citizens, treating a democratically elected political party like a terror threat, and potentially illegal surveillance recordings. That's just a taste of the inquiry into the use of private investigators by government agencies. There's a call for criminal charges, and more than a dozen police staff are under scrutiny too for passing on unauthorised, sensitive information to one particular security company. It's official, there will be a binding referendum on whether we should legalise cannabis for personal use. Will it be enough to coax out younger voters? And it reads like a crime drama, millions and millions of dollars of cash stuffed into suitcases.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora, good afternoon. Ko Katrina Batten tēnei. The Prime Minister says a State Services Commission investigation into the use of external security companies reveals disturbing and unethical behaviour. Jacinda Ardern was briefed on the report, which was released this morning. The inquiry was critical of the private security firm Thompson & Clark, which used an unlicensed private investigator to secretly record closed meetings for the Quake claim settlement company Southern Response. It also showed that Thompson & Clark had access to the transport agency motor vehicle register and made more than 4,000 number plate searches between 2011 and 2017. Ms Ardern says the problems highlighted by the report need to be rectified.
Look, it does demonstrate some pretty disturbing behaviour, unethical behaviour that we would not expect as part of the work commissioned by the public service.
Jacinda Ardern. There's now a call for the chairperson of Southern Response, Ross Butler, to be sacked. The State Services Commissioner has asked the police to investigate what it calls illegal spying for Southern Response. The spying was on claimants who organised information evenings for those struggling to settle their claims. One of the organisers of the meetings, Cam Preston, says people had a right to expect their privacy to be preserved and Mr Butler should go.
It's a basic democratic right for people to be able to get together and discuss issues, and if we're in a free and democratic society, then we should be able to do that.
Cam Preston. In a statement, Mr Butler apologises for Southern Response's actions and says its clients had a right to expect they could express their views freely. Meanwhile, the police say there is no evidence of corrupt behaviour after it was revealed 16 police officers were linked to the security company at the heart of the State Services inquiry. The police weren't included in the State Services Commission's investigation, so launched one of their own. 4 officers were found to have been working for both police and security firms at the same time. 3 of those were dealt with and 1 has been referred to the Professional Conduct Group. It's been revealed a recording of the jailed Czech drug smuggler Karel Schrubeck calling his wife from prison was the new information that prompted the Immigration Minister Ian Lees-Galloway to reassess his decision not to deport him. RNZ has heard the recording in which Mr Schrubeck angrily berates his ex-wife about sending a letter of support to his immigration lawyer without letting him see it first. It's also been revealed the Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern took steps to make sure the woman was safe. Immigration officials and the police were sent to check on her, and National's Mark Mitchell followed up the matter himself. Mr Lees-Galloway says it was that information that made him reassess his decision.
That evidence is what inspired me to set about a new course of action to look into those matters and to make sure, one, that we had correct information for making decisions, and 2, that her safety was being taken care of.
The Immigration Minister Ian Lees-Galloway. A petition has been presented to Parliament this afternoon by the grieving parents of a teen killed in a hit and run. 19-year-old Rule LaRue hit and killed 15-year-old Auckland cyclist Nathan Kratzkow in May. She'd been drinking and smoking marijuana. Last week, LaRue was sentenced to 11 months home detention, 250 hours of community work, and was disqualified from driving for 2.5 years. However, Nathan Kratzkow's parents have received about 144,000 signatures in a petition to appeal that sentence. Speaking outside Parliament, his father, Orion Kratzkow, fought back tears and says justice needs to be served.
Our cheeky, loving boy has been robbed of his future and fulfilling his dream of being in the Air Force. The dream he'd held since he was 5. We feel we have been let down and ignored, and we're now asking the Crown to make this right.
Orion Kratzkow. Crown Law says it's considering appealing the sentence. A woman who carried $3.5 million in cash in suitcases as part of the country's largest methamphetamine operation has been jailed for 14.5 years. The 29-year-old, who has name suppression, was in charge of counting and delivering the money. She also coordinated other co-offenders to move methamphetamine throughout Auckland. In the High Court in Auckland, Justice Palmer said the woman played an important role in the operation.
It is clear you treated the supply of methamphetamine as a business. You took preventative measures against getting caught, changing phones regularly and using coded languages, a variety of vehicles and cutouts to transfer drugs. You appear to have ignored the human misery you caused.
Justice Palmer. It's 5:05. Sport, a century to Kusal Mendes has Sri Lanka well placed to at least make New Zealand bat again in the first cricket test in Wellington. Mendes brought up his 6th test century shortly after the tea break, the Sri Lankan number 5 and Angelo Matthews extending their partnership beyond 200. A short time ago, the visitors still had not lost a wicket today and were 232 for 3 in their second innings, needing 64 runs to force the Black Caps to bat again. Matthews was also approaching 3 figures on 97 not out. Meanwhile, Australia have wrapped up victory in the second test against India in Perth, starting the 5th and final day 5 wickets down for 112 and needing 287 to win. The visitors have lasted just 15 more overs to be all out for 140. The result ties the 4-match series at 1-1. The new Blues coach, Leon MacDonald, says the Super Rugby side are already benefiting from the involvement of former All Black Martin Nonu. A 2-time World Cup winner, Nonu has returned for a 3rd stint with the Blues next year after 3 seasons in France. MacDonald says Nonu has brought a selfless attitude into pre-season and the 36-year-old has been running around like a teenager.
He's rubbing shoulders with young guys, he's doing a lot of skill work, he takes it upon himself to sit down with the guys and give feedback. He's desperate for feedback from the coaching group. He wants to grow his own game and at the moment I think he's just taking it day by day and week by week and adjusting back to life in New Zealand. Rugby is a little bit different here than in France and I think he's enjoying that.
Blues coach Leon MacDonald. That's the news.
A call for immediate action on slave labour.
For quite some time we actually failed these workers and therefore we have to act now.
Tai Hoa on a treaty settlement.
It's 168 years of Crown failure and Crown breaches and it is going to take time to get there.
And hosing things down from the top.
If I'm stand accused of possessing a phone and being contactable, then fair enough.
Hard but fair. Morning Report with Susie Ferguson and Guy Aspinall, weekdays from 6. Then on 9 to noon, North Korea in 2018. What hopes are there now for denuclearisation? And after 10, actor Tom Sainsbury on getting under Paula Bennett's skin. Join me, Catherine Ryan, on 9 to noon after Morning Report on RNZ National.
Met Service weather through to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Manawatu, including the central high country, mainly fine. However, isolated showers from this afternoon. Rain developing tomorrow afternoon south of Waikato with possible heavy falls and coastal thunderstorms later. Coromandel Peninsula, Bay of Plenty, Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, mainly fine but isolated showers. Wairarapa, Horowhenua Kapiti Coast and Wellington, cloudy periods of rain tomorrow, briefly heavy around midday for Wellington and Wairarapa. Nelson and Marlborough, mainly fine today, scattered rain tomorrow. Bulla and Westland, periods of rain with some heavy falls. Canterbury and Otago, scattered rain spreading north today, becoming persistent and widespread tomorrow. Northwest gales and exposed inland places until this evening. Fiordland and Southland, a few showers frequent for a time this evening and tonight, mainly fine tomorrow, and for the Chatham Islands, fine, occasional rain from tomorrow afternoon. It's 5:08 and you're listening to Checkpoint.
Thanks, Katrina. And I'm Lisa Owen. We'll be with you for the next hour. Spying on innocent citizens just going about their daily lives is an affront to democracy. That's according to an investigation into the use of security consultants by government agencies, all 131 of them. The inquiry was initially sparked by complaints about government-owned insurer Southern Response and its use of private investigator Thompson and Clark to spy on Christchurch quake claimants. The State Services Commissioner has laid a police complaint about potentially illegal recordings made at several private insurance meetings. But Thompson and Clark's tentacles spread further across the public sector, from the Transport Agency and Crown Law to the Ministry of Primary Industries and the police, mainly between 2011 and 2016. The inquiry also found Thompson and Clark had been reporting on so-called issues-motivated groups such as Greenpeace, the Green Party, the Mana Movement and some iwi groups, and the groups were treated as security threats. And that, State Services Commissioner Peter Hughes says, isn't acceptable.
I guess what concerns me most is that one of the external security consultants, Thompson and Clark Limited, has treated the issue of issues-motivated groups as a security threat in its reporting to government agencies. And I'm disappointed that the government agencies concerned did not push back on this, did not challenge it. So this sort of behaviour, in my view, is an affront to democracy, and it's not consistent with how we ought to view democratic freedoms, and it's not appropriate for government agencies to be involved with. It is never acceptable to conduct surveillance on New Zealanders simply because they are lawfully protesting or a member of a specific interest group. It's underhand, and it's not the way we do things in New Zealand.
Peter Hughes says the way Thompson and Clark dealt with such groups was part of a large number of issues uncovered by the report.
The inquiries provided evidence that while contracted by the government agencies, Thompson and Clark used an unlicensed private investigator, covertly attended public meetings without disclosing their purpose or the identity of their client, produced electronic recordings of some meetings, some of which were closed without the consent of the attendees at those meetings. They approached public servants who had access to sensitive information for secondary employment with themselves. They accessed the motor vehicle register for improper purposes. They advised the client not to disclose the source of information obtained inappropriately to the police. Likely, they provided information obtained by surveillance for private sector clients to government agencies without disclosing the source and the nature of the information supplied. And they were not consistent in retaining information collected, records of information collected. Now, all of these findings point to a pattern of behaviour by Thompson and Clark that does not meet the professional standard I would expect of any consultant working on behalf of government.
State Services Commissioner Peter Hughes on the investigation into the use of external security consultants. The man whose case sparked the State Services Commissioner's inquiry says heads should roll in response to its findings, starting with Southern Response Chair Ross Butler. Cam Preston was amongst a group of Quake claimants that organised a series of meetings from 2014 to discuss how to get progress on claims with the government-owned insurance agency Southern Response. These are the meetings the inquiry says were surreptitiously recorded by private investigators Thompson and Clark, with the information then fed to Southern Response. The Commission says this breached its code of conduct and may have been done illegally. It's passed the matter on to the police to investigate, but Cam Preston says action needs to be wider than that.
My view is that it's really, you have to look beyond that, and you have to look at the bureaucrats that actually paid these invoices, that they were using the information that was being generated, and for them to turn around and say, well, we don't know, or we've deleted the recordings, or we've deleted the blog. I simply don't believe that. And look, from our perspective, there was never any sort of security threat whatsoever on our part, and I think it's really sad, and I think the Commissioner made the point that it's a basic democratic right for people to be able to get together and discuss issues, and if we're in a free and democratic society, then we should be able to do that.
Cam Preston there. In a statement, Southern Response Chair Mr Butler apologises for the insurer's actions and says its clients had a right to expect they could express their views freely without Southern Response's knowledge. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern told reporters alarm bells should have rung earlier about the behaviour identified in the report.
Does demonstrate some pretty disturbing behaviour, unethical behaviour that we would not expect as part of the work commissioned by the public service. So our job now is to make sure it's rectified, the things that happened over a 10-year period.
Where does the buck stop?
Ultimately, we need to make sure that the situation is rectified, that all of the recommendations are followed through on. It did happen over the course of 10 years, but we're the ones in government now, so we need to be seen to be dealing with it.
Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. Meanwhile, Greater Christchurch Regeneration Minister Megan Woods told me she's not happy with the conduct of Southern Response, and she'll be talking to the chair of the company this evening.
Oh, look, I'm disappointed, I'm concerned, and I'm actually really saddened for the people of Christchurch. I think that there's been some unease in Christchurch over a number of years, and that people felt pretty vulnerable. And what this report makes really clear is that from the initial good intent of making sure the staff at Southern Response felt safe and protected, and that was absolutely appropriate. This morphed into about being brand protection and reputation protection for the organisation, and it is unacceptable.
So what are you going to do about it?
Well, I'm having a meeting with the chair tonight by telephone. He's not in Wellington, and I am, but I'll be catching up with him later tonight. We have already exchanged some correspondence. We did that prior to the formal release of the report today, and I made it really clear to him that I was really disappointed in the conduct of Southern Response, and that once I received the final copy of the report, I'd be considering what, if any, steps were necessary, and I need to have a conversation with him this evening.
So, will the chair still be the chair tomorrow after this conversation?
I need to have a conversation with him this evening, and I'll have more to say after that.
Well, these board members were founding board members. They were there during this time. Who do you think is responsible for this culture?
Oh, look, the board were aware that Thompson and Clark had been engaged, the initial engagement, and one of the issues, and the report goes through this in quite a lot of detail, is actually the fact there wasn't a formal contract put in place. And if there'd been the formal contract, what I would expect actually is that the board would have put in place a monitoring mechanism.
Okay, so Minister, if the board knew about this company, they're responsible, aren't they? So specifically, will you be asking the chair for his resignation?
And Lisa, as I said, I'll have more to say after I've had a further conversation with the chair. I want the opportunity to have that conversation with the chair. As I've said, I've exchanged correspondence with him. He's well aware.
Has he offered his resignation, Minister?
No, he hasn't offered his resignation, but he is very aware that I am very disappointed in the conduct of Southern Response. He has apologised in a letter, and he's apologised in a press statement today, but he and I need to have a further conversation this evening.
How do you think that any confidence can be had in Southern Response if the same people are at the helm?
Oh, as I said, Lisa, I'm not defending this action. I think when it went beyond defending staff safety, when it morphed into protecting the brand and the reputation of the entity, then people were let down. So it is my job to have a conversation with the chair tonight, and I'll have more to say after that. Is
it possible for people to have confidence if you keep all of these players in there? Is it possible to restore confidence?
I think what the people of Christchurch can have confidence is that when I read an OIA that was going out that contained emails that alarmed me, I contacted the State Services Commissioner and said that this needed to be looked into because it concerned me that this was the way in which the state was essentially playing out, that it went beyond protecting staff, and I will always stand up for the organisation that they do have a right to protect their staff, but in this case, it is really clear that it morphed into about protecting brand and reputation.
Well, it morphed into treating their customers like terrorists and criminals, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. That people have the right to attend a public meeting in this country without thinking there's someone sitting there recording it when there's explicitly been asked if there's representatives of an organisation in the meeting.
That being the case, how can they stay on?
As I said, Lisa, I'll have more to say after I have a conversation with the chair this evening.
I want to go back to this question of culture. So who did cultivate this culture? Who's responsible for that?
Well, I know that in terms of my job, in terms of the leadership that I have to give the organisation as one of the shareholding ministers, is that when I see things that alarm me, I need to call those out. And that is something that I will always do, and it's what I've done in this case.
Sorry to interrupt you, Minister, but I know you have to go soon. So did the chair call out this behaviour? Did the CEO call out this behaviour?
Look, I need to have some more conversations with the board chair tonight. The CEO, who was there at the time, is no longer at the organisation. Yeah. One of the things that the report points out that you would have seen also that the recordings weren't kept, which is also something else that
evidence was destroyed.
Yes, and that is of concern. So it's actually quite hard to ascertain exactly what was recorded. But I will have more to say after I've had a conversation with the chair this evening.
Right. Before you go, do you have confidence in your chair, Ross Butler? Do you maintain confidence?
I'm really disappointed in the conduct of Southern Response, and I need to have a further conversation with him this evening.
That kind of sounds like you're on the fence there. So, once again, do you have confidence in him?
Look, Lisa, we could probably sit here going back and forward all evening on this, but I will have more to say after I've had a further conversation with the board chair this evening.
No, the easy way to resolve it is if you have confidence, tell us.
I need to have a conversation with the board chair this evening.
So that's a no. You don't have confidence in him.
I need to have a conversation with the board chair this evening. And actually, I have given him that undertaking that we will have a conversation, and I'm going to stick to my word on that.
That's Minister Megan Woods. Greenpeace Executive Director Dr Russell Norman believes he was spied on in his current role and as a former co-leader of the Green Party. He spoke to our producer Bridget Burke a short time ago.
Whether you oppose the previous government in terms of the earthquake response or animal rights or climate change policy, whatever it was, then the previous government was willing to work with Thompson and Clark to put you under surveillance because you simply oppose government policy, and that's totally unacceptable in a free and democratic society.
What does the government of today need to do now? What are the next steps? What are your expectations of the country's leadership in response to this?
Well, we need to see some prosecutions of those who are involved, and of course some of those investigations are already underway, but I think we also need to break up some of the government agencies that have been proven to be partisan, in particular the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. I mean, the State Service Commission came to the conclusion that MB was in breach of the Code of Conduct, the State Services Code of Conduct, when it came to impartiality. That is, that MB took the side of the oil industry against anyone that dared challenge the oil industry, in particular Greenpeace.
What's most galling about what they've been doing?
So when Thompson and Clark were unlawfully accessing the NZTA database of registration, vehicle registrations, in order to find out who was visiting Greenpeace offices, then Simon Bridges was the Minister of Transport responsible for overseeing the protection of that database, which he obviously failed to do. When MB was working with Thompson and Clark in order to spy on climate activists and follow us to our houses, Simon Bridges was the Minister of Energy. So I think Simon Bridges has some questions to answer. Did he direct officials to engage in spying against climate activists, or was he just unable to do his job to provide oversight to make sure they acted lawfully and followed the Code of Conduct?
And National leader Simon Bridges denies giving any directive to government agencies when he was a minister.
I don't know any of these things. I haven't read the report. I would like to read it, but I think what we can tell straight away is it's clearly wrong what's gone on here, and badly so. I agree that it's anti-democratic for an agency like this working on behalf of the government, those government departments, to be spying on NGOs, political parties, and I'm sure there's recommendations in those reports that should be looked at seriously and, you know, if all things being equal, followed.
And that is National Party leader Simon Bridges. A binding referendum on whether cannabis for personal use should be legalised is expected to be a draw card for youth voters. New Zealanders will get to have their say on cannabis, along with who they want to govern the country at the 2020 general election. Cabinet signed off on the referendum, which fulfils part of the confidence and supply deal between Labor and the Greens. Here's our political editor, Jane Patterson.
Last week, the government passed legislation establishing the regime for medicinal cannabis. Now it's confirmed the timing for the referendum.
The agreement is that it will be binding. There's a bit of detail still to work through, but we can tell you we're telling the Electoral Commission that that's when it's going to be.
Andrew Little says the Electoral Commission will now start planning for it.
Having made the decision now, the Electoral Commission has put together a budget bid for the budget process for next year. So that decision having been made, we'll now process that budget bid. That obviously will attract budget confidentiality, so we'll know about that next May.
But Nationals leader Simon Bridges questions the government's motivation for holding it at the same time as a general election.
You know, I'm pretty cynical that you've got a government here that wants to distract from the core issues of a general election, like who's best to govern, their actual record in government over the last 3 years, and core issues around the economy, tax, cost of living, health, education and law and order.
The Greens' Chloe Swarbrick, whose medicinal cannabis bill failed at its first reading reading earlier this year says this is a major issue.
And indeed moving away from the war on drugs. This is a massive health issue, this is a massive justice issue, it's a massive issue with equity too.
And she says cost was a factor in the timing.
I mean, absolutely, there's cost implications for holding it outside of the general election. That's what we saw with the flag referendum, which was a huge amount of public money spent. So it is absolutely a cost reduction to be holding it in line with the general election.
Tania Swicki-Mead, the Executive Director of Just Speak, which gives a youth perspective on criminal justice, says the timing could be helpful in boosting youth turnout.
Many young people see the way that we approach this drug as being really out of step with how we, for example, regulate alcohol. And of course, as we know, young people really need to feel that issues being debated in general elections have a real impact on their lives, to feel like they've been included in the conversation about that election.
On the streets of Mount Wellington in Auckland, there was plenty of support for the referendum, with many people keen to see a new approach towards cannabis.
It's a good idea to shift management of drugs from a criminal issue to a health issue.
As long as education's with it, I suppose, yeah. And if the police put their resources into maybe helping use suicide instead of getting people for smoking a joint or speeding, that would be useful to the country as well.
My missus has got muscular dystrophy, which is a deterioration of the muscle, and cannabis is meant to help, stop it from happening. So, yeah, medicinal purposes, excellent.
I don't know, that could be fun. I don't think it's going to be too bad if that goes through, but I don't know, there's not a huge amount of negative consequences that I can think of. Yeah, I'm all for it.
I don't know, I guess it just depends on the individuals and whether or not they're going to abuse the use of it or the purpose behind the use of it.
I don't believe that we should be just making it carte blanche available for everyone, because we've seen what alcohol's done, and we've seen how alcohol has significantly disadvantaged appropriate behaviour in society. And I think cannabis will do the same thing long term.
It will be really helpful to people that require it for medicinal reasons. Apparently it soothes them with the pain that they're going through, so I'd be really happy to support it, and I'd be proud of New Zealand if they actually pass it as a bill.
There are two other possible referenda. The first is on euthanasia. The ACT leader David Seymour is working on a members' bill, and that looks likely to include a provision for a referendum. The other is on changes to electoral law, specifically to lower the party vote threshold to 4% and remove the so-called coattailing provision. That decision will be made by ministers. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Jane Patterson.
Fighting back tears, the grieving parents of a teen killed in a hit and run are still waiting for justice for their aspiring Air Force cadet. 19-year-old Roulé LaRue hit and killed 15-year-old Auckland cyclist Nathan Kratsko in May. His emotional parents presented a petition with more than 145,000 signatures to politicians on the steps of Parliament today to force an appeal. Our Defence reporter Jonathan Mitchell was there.
LaRue had been drinking and smoking marijuana before she killed 15-year-old Nathan Kratsko as he crossed an Auckland intersection on a small bike. Last week she was sentenced to 11 months home detention, 250 hours community work, and was disqualified from driving for 2.5 years. Today on the steps of Parliament, Nathan's dad, Orion Kratsko, paid tribute to his son.
Our cheeky, loving boy has been robbed of his future and fulfilling his dream of being in the Air Force. A dream he'd held since he was 5. Feel we have been let down and ignored, and we're now asking the Crown to make this right.
Mum Charlene Kratsko says LaRue has shown no remorse by bragging of her freedom and posting on social media.
Also outside the courtroom we had her friends drive past, 3 girls in a car screaming, "She's free, she's free." I mean, it's just the little things that we've had to deal with everything else that's gone on. I mean, if she showed remorse, none of that would be happening behind it all. And if she showed genuine remorse, we probably would have gone, okay, she's remorseful, she's sorry, you know, it's horrible, it's an accident and it's horrible, but she's shown no remorse at all.
National MP Mark Mitchell was at Parliament to receive the petition. He says the death is horrific.
If you start signalling that you are starting to go soft on crime, then these are the sort of sentences that we're going to start to see. And I'll tell you what, New Zealand will not accept that. And that's a big part of why Orion and Charlene are here with us today in Parliament in Wellington.
Orion Kratsko says prison time would be an appropriate punishment.
If you were a 19-year-old and they sent you locked up at home, I mean, it's not really going to affect you, I don't think, or affect other kids in changing what they do.
The petition will now be tabled in Parliament before going to a select committee. Crown Law says it's considering appealing the sentence. For Checkpoint, Court Jonathan Mitchell, Tēnei.
And just in response to that story about Rule LaRue and the petition being taken to Parliament to have her sentence appealed, this person says, I got home from work and had turned on the TV to watch RNZ get ready for Checkpoint. I saw a photo of the petition about the light sentence of Rule LaRue being accepted by the opposition, ? He says. I hope I saw wrong because that's not what I signed the petition for. It is not a political statement for an opposition party to play with and do politics with, says Bert. Thanks for your feedback, Bert. Coming up, the Deputy Commissioner Mike Clement on the actions of police officers who passed on unauthorised information to Thompson and Clark. Victoria University threatens legal action after a bid to change its name was dismissed, and a small but noisy group of protesters vents their anger over a proposal to build an egg-producing farm in North Waikato. We would love your feedback, particularly on Thompson and Clark, on snooping and spying. You can text us on 2101 or you can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, Facebook us, Checkpoint, or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. But first, here's Katrina with the headlines.
There are calls for the chairperson of Southern Response, Ross Butler, to be sacked following a damning report into the behaviour of a private security firm in some government departments. The inquiry by the State Services Commission found the company, Thompson and Clark, used an unlicensed private investigator and recorded closed meetings with the government-owned insurer Southern Response and Christchurch quake claimants without their knowledge or consent. One of the meeting organisers, Cam Preston, says people had a right to expect their privacy to be preserved and Mr Butler should go. The minister responsible for Greater Christchurch Regeneration, Megan Woods, says she's very disappointed and will be talking to Mr Butler this evening. It's been revealed a recording of the jailed Czech drug smuggler Karel Schrubeck angrily calling his wife from prison was the new information that prompted the Immigration Minister Ian Lees-Galloway to reassess his decision not to deport him. The Corrections Department recording has been released by the National Party. Victoria University isn't ruling out legal action after the Education Minister moved to stop it changing its name. Chris Hipkins has denied an application for the institution to change its name to University of Wellington. The university says it's now looking at its options. The parents of a teenage cyclist killed in a hit-and-run crash want the killer to serve time in jail. 19-year-old Rule LaRue hit and killed 15-year-old Nathan Kratskow in May, but was sentenced to home detention. Nathan's parents today presented a petition with 145,000 signatures to Parliament to appeal the sentence. The Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern's bill to reduce child poverty has been passed by Parliament. The legislation requires the current and future governments to measure and report on child poverty and set out plans to reduce it. It was supported by all parties except ACT. Those are the headlines. More news and weather at 6.
Thanks, Katrina. And Nona Peltier is in the studio now for business. Fletcher Building, Nona, they have sold a major asset. What's going on?
They sold their Formica business, which is a big one, and that follows the sale of their roof tile business last month. So they sold Formica. They announced that today for $1.23 billion. It's a very good price for that company. It was more than the analysts were expecting. And as a result of that, their share price have done pretty well. Not only that, but they're going to reinstate their dividend. So after a couple of really hard years for Fletcher, where they lost about $1 billion in their construction business, we're now expecting them to potentially turn around. We'll see what happens. But anyway, their share price rose 2%. That was 10 cents up to $4.93. Now that compares with the overall index down about 2/3%. That's in line with what we saw in Wall Street, a bit of a horror show there. And Asia's not looking a whole lot better, and we can expect to see that weakness continue because there's a lot of uncertainty over what's going to happen with the U.S. Federal Reserve on interest rates. It could point to some weakening in the U.S. economy. That won't be a good sign. It's pretty good for our, so just to finish up there with the index, we were down 2/3%, 57 points down to 8,688. Different story for the dollar. We were up a little bit again because of this U.S. dollar, U.S. federal interest rate question mark. We were at 68.5 U.S. cents, 95.2 Australian, which I'm sure travellers to Australia will be happy about.
Yeah.
And 54.2 pence. So not reflecting some of that question mark over Brexit. So overall, we're seeing a lot of uncertainty, and you can expect to see that for the rest of the week, I'd say.
All right, thanks, Nona. Appreciate it. That's Nona Peltier with your business update there. More than a dozen police staff are under investigation for passing sensitive information to the private investigators, Thompson and Clark, outside of official channels. The police did their own parallel investigation into the use of security firms and found no evidence they were using private investigators for surveillance, no evidence of criminal or corrupt behaviour by police staff. So I asked Deputy Commissioner Mike Clement about the actions of individual police officers who were passing unauthorised information to Thompson and Clark.
There was 19 officers or people involved who are employed by police, and 20 occasions that we've sort of got our eyes over in terms of making sure that we're 100% sure that if there was doubt involved, that we're going to address that. So there's still work to do with regard to the detail of that, but we've got enough concern at first glance to say, let's have another look at it. Yeah,
at first glance, it appears that they were passing on information that they shouldn't have been. So what exactly were they passing on? Give me some examples.
Well, so what happens is Thompson and Clark or other security consultants or anybody for that matter, but if they have a request of police, we've got to look at all of those 20,000 a year Official Information Act requests and say, on the basis of the principles of the Act, should we respond? So that's what Thompson and Clark did, and what we should do is, against the principles in the Act, disclose or not disclose. And when we've looked at these instances, what we've said is that we think that maybe they've gone too far in terms of the information that's been provided, or we want to know more information before we're
Deputy Commissioner, I am sorry to interrupt you, but the reality is here, you have identified a number of occasions, forget the Official Information Act, you have identified a number of occasions where you believe that information was passed inappropriately to a private commercial operation, namely Thompson and Clark. What are examples of the information that was passed on in those circumstances?
Well, they might be typically undertaking an investigation on behalf of a private organisation, for example. And I can't I mean, I know you want me to, but I can't disregard the Official Information Act. So they're entitled, just like anybody else is, to make an inquiry of police with regard to information we hold. So against the principles in the Act, because I do have to keep bringing it back to that, because that's where the shortcomings are identified, is that against the principles in the Act, then we have to exercise care with regard to what we provide them back.
And I understand that. I understand how you applied the Official Information Act. I'm asking for examples where you think they acted outside of policy and principle. So I can read the list if you won't give me examples. So a burglary victim's details were passed on to Thompson and Clark with the suggestion that Thompson and Clark could provide security for that person. The names of alleged youth offenders were passed on with apparently no consideration given to their vulnerability. What other things were passed on?
Well, they are good examples. I mean, it's on the report and it's on the website. I'm not trying to withhold anything from anybody. I'm just saying the reality is they've asked for information about an investigation they're conducting on behalf of a third party. They come to us for information that we might hold that might assist that investigation, and we should provide the information on that basis. So you rightly point out in that case is that the victim's details were provided on the basis that TCIL might be able to offer security advice to that victim. We would argue, and that's subject to further exploration, that that's excessive in terms of what our obligations were.
Well, doesn't it actually seem a bit crass?
Well, at the end of the day, I guess what I trust is people's intent. So if somebody was intent on making sure a victim was safe, what I want to believe is they provided the details on the basis that they thought that TCIL might better help them keep safe. The reality is that was an extension over and above what the requirements of the Act are on police with regard to the provision of information. So they are the types of incidents that we've got concern about, and which we will make sure in future we exercise more care about in terms of providing information.
The thing is, well, I'm wondering why, because people listening to this will think, hey, Thompson and Clark were getting stellar, top shelf, gold star treatment from the police. Why? Do you treat other security firms the same as you were treating this one?
Well, as I said earlier, we do about at least 20,000 Official Information Act requests a year. So there's a myriad of requests coming to us, including from media, actually. But, I mean...
But were there other security companies identified? Were there other companies identified where you inappropriately gave them information, or just Thompson and Clark?
There are a myriad of security companies who inquire of police every day. For instance, insurance security.
But that's not my question. My question is, Thompson and Clark, you found a number of times where it's questionable actions of police officers giving information to Thompson and Clark. Was there any other investigations company that you also found was getting information inappropriately from the police, or was it just Thompson and Clark?
In this investigation, just Thompson and Clark.
Right, OK, so Thompson and Clark, aren't some of them old police officers?
Yes, they are.
OK, so does that explain the relationship and the free flow of information?
Well, I hope not, but I mean, the reality, you asked the question, I don't have the answer. The bottom line is that they used to be police officers, and so are a lot of other security companies populated by ex-police officers, because it's a skill set, I guess, that you can transfer from police into the wider world. When they leave police, they may indeed, because of their skill set, go and work in security companies, and they may go and work in investigations and intelligence and other government agencies as well. It's one of those things that we can't be in denial about. They've gathered those skills through policing. What we're saying to our people is, regardless of whether the fact that they used to be in police, you've got to keep your professional distance. I mean, you can't unknow these people if they've gone out into the big wide world, but you've got to maintain a professional distance when it comes to your interactions with them for the very reason we're talking about.
Well,
so it's absolutely going to be the message back to our people, is that you must exercise care with regard to those relationships that existed, but now they're on a different footing.
Well, the other thing is the report identifies perhaps inappropriately close relationships. Morning teas paid for by Thompson and Clark, invitations to go out for drinks that were quote-unquote meetings in pubs. Is any of that appropriate?
Well, there's a line to be drawn. If the meeting is as a consequence of their formal business and engagement with police, then the answer is no. But if we're asking people to sever ties from, long-standing relationships, then I would say that's probably a bridge too far. But it's one of the, bring you back to the comment that I made, is that our people have to exercise caution for this very reason, because the perception, if not the reality, is clear for all to see, is that the engagement or the nature of the engagement might be seen to be inappropriate, and we have to be extremely careful of that.
How do you
think... the point that's made in the investigation, and we'll be reminding our people of that. It's a constant. People have to be on their guard.
So how do you think this looks to the public? How do you seriously think it looks to members of the public listening to this?
Well, I'll just come back to the scope of the investigation. It's a 15-year period. It's 16 occasions on which we've got the reason to inquire further. So on its face, is it massive? No, it's not. Is it criminal or corrupt? No, it's not. Were they tasked by us or directed by us, as in TCIL? No, they weren't. And the vast majority was consistent. So I think we've got some areas of concern that we want to delve further into, but I think perspective is everything.
Is it just a dodgy old boys club? Is that the problem here?
Well, I think I'll come back to what I said earlier, is that people, you can't unknow people, you can't sort of disassociate from long-standing relationships, and our job as an executive, mine as the Deputy Commissioner of National Operations, will be
but the police need to be
people
above reproach, don't they? That's the whole point. There's a higher standard. You're in uniform, you're sworn officers, people have higher expectations, and, well, would you think that you've met them? with this?
Well, what you've just said is exactly right. We pride ourselves on exactly that. That is the message that we constantly give. You cannot allow the door to be opened with regard to criticism about the way in which we engage with people outside of New Zealand Police. But at the same time, you've got to be human. I mean, we are human. You cannot unknow people. They might have long-standing associations, and our people just have to have the wherewithal to manage both.
Okay.
That they can still be friends, but they've got to have a professional distance when it comes to the business.
I notice in your report there is a clause in there that says it's recommended that a public-facing version of this report with appropriate redactions be disseminated by publication on the New Zealand Police website. What's a public-facing report? Is that a watered-down version?
No, because ironically, we've actually got obligations under the Privacy Act and Official Information Act to preserve the principles in both. And
that
so
is kind of ironic, isn't it?
Yes, well, it's not lost on me, and I know you're going to make a point of it, so I might as well get it out there. The bottom line is that that's the approach that we like to think that we take each and every time. This report has reminded us that we've got to be vigilant all of the time.
And that was Deputy Commissioner Mike Clement. Now, the staff who passed on information to Thompson and Clark are now subject to a Code of Conduct investigation. And the police are also investigating the complaint from the State Services Commissioner about potentially illegal recordings made by Thompson and Clark. Just some of your feedback on the story coming in. This one says, somebody gave the orders for spying and also paid the bills. Who? They say. And also Ash has got in contact saying this goes way beyond the behaviour of the chairperson of Southern Response. Which National Party ministers had knowledge of government departments using Thompson and Clark under the spurious guise of monitoring terrorist activities? We'll have more of your feedback on that story a little later in the show. A woman who transported $3.5 million in cash around Auckland in suitcases during the country's biggest methamphetamine operation has been jailed for 14.5 years. The 29-year-old, who can't be named, was in charge of counting the money and coordinating drop-offs throughout the city. Our court reporter, Annika Smith, was at her sentencing and filed this report.
Appearing in the High Court this morning, the woman fanned her face to hold back tears as she sat in the dock. She was responsible for counting and delivering 4 suitcases full of cash and organising others to move methamphetamine and cocaine through Auckland in 2016. In one drop-off, almost 15 kilograms of meth was handed over in Manyarewa's Tōtara Park in a sports bag. In another, 9 kilograms was left in a car parked on the side of Dominion Road. The meth was traced back to a 500-kilogram haul, a New Zealand record, which washed ashore on 90 Mile Beach in June 2016. Crown Prosecutor Nick Webby said while the woman, who has name suppression, wasn't the operation's kingpin, she played an important role.
She was entrusted to count and deliver millions of dollars worth of cash, money which had clearly come from drug-related offending.
He submitted a starting point of 18 years imprisonment, but the woman's defence lawyer, Maria Pekotic, said it should be 13 years. Ms Pekotic said her client was vulnerable and suffered from anxiety, depression and post-traumatic stress disorder.
Because of this personal background and things that have happened to her, this has led her to follow instructions and offend without questioning the actions that she was asked to complete.
Justice Palmer began his sentencing by saying those who deal meth cause and profit from human misery. He said while the woman wasn't leading the operation, she was a trusted communication link.
It is clear you treated the supply of methamphetamine as a business. You took preventative measures against getting caught, changing phones regularly and using coded languages, a variety of vehicles and cutouts to transfer drugs. You appear to have ignored the human misery you caused.
The judge said her elaborate offending meant she posed a moderate to high risk to others, but said she had potential to do better with her life.
You are relatively young. You've never been convicted or received a prison sentence before. You have 2 children. You are clearly intelligent and competent and capable of better things and a better life. I think you're a strong woman.
He urged her to take up counselling and any rehabilitative programs available to her in prison before jailing her for 14.5 years. With no minimum non-parole period imposed, she will be eligible for release in 5 years. Atuiti ko te mātua ko Annika Smith aho.
Wellington's Victoria University is threatening legal action after a bid to change its name was shot down. The Education Minister has declined the application for the institution to change its name to the University of Wellington, saying he's not convinced it listened to opposition from the wider community. But the university's Vice-Chancellor says the Minister is not an expert on the issue and his decision doesn't necessarily signal the end of its rebranding exercise. Laura Dooney reports.
Students' reaction to the news Vic Uni will, for now, remain Vic Uni was positive.
Well, it seems a lot of people are pretty happy about it.
Has there been much chat about it on campus?
A lot of chat, yeah. I feel like, at least it seems to me, that most of the student body has been reasonably opposed to the change, simply because I think there's a lot of history involved with the name.
I'm honestly so pleased. It's such a waste of money to change the name of the university, and it really could be spent elsewhere.
I just don't think it's that much of a big deal. It's just really a name, and if we wanted to rebrand to something, I think we can do better than Wellington University.
Well, literally from the group chat we've currently had, which was the name's not changing, it was wow, thumbs up, great news.
Education Minister Chris Hipkins says while benefits from a name change had been identified, there was significant opposition.
Ultimately, the significant opposition from staff, students and the alumni did play a role, and I'm not convinced that the University Council have discharged their responsibilities under the Act to act in a way that is accountable to the wider university community.
He says he was referred to an online petition against the name change that had more than 10,000 signatures. But Vice-Chancellor Grant Guildford says consultation was very thorough, and the submissions against the name change came from a small number of alumni.
Both in public forums and public notices and social media and you name it, we tried everything we possibly could do. So as thorough consultation, and it is worthwhile noting that there is no legal requirement for the university to consult, but we decided to do so anyway because we felt it was the right thing to do.
Mr Guildford says the Minister is not an expert in the best interests of the university. That's what its council is for. He says the Minister declining the application because it was controversial sets a dangerous precedent that could affect University Council decisions in the future. He says the university now has 3 options to consider.
Whether we accept the Minister's decision, noting that he's not an expert in what's the best interests of our university, deciding whether to legally challenge based on whether he's acted illegally or unreasonably, or we've got undue concern at precedent for this university and others, or we'll look at altering the name and branding of the university to ensure that we can get that distinctiveness that we need offshore.
Mr Guildford says that could be as simple as making the Wellington more bold and prominent than the Victoria in the university's branding. The council will consider its options in February at its first meeting of the year. In Wellington, for Checkpoint, call Laura Dooney aho.
The Immigration Minister has revealed plans to streamline the visa application process for overseas workers to make it easier for regions and industries struggling with labour shortages. Ian Lees-Galloway made the announcement in Ashburton, where he told farmers and other business owners the current system was too complex and employers needed a straightforward process for hiring migrant workers. Our reporter Katie Todd was there.
Ashburton's Mayor Donna Favour says today's announcement felt like an early Christmas present after months battling with a major labour shortage. Young people moving away from Ashburton have left behind 500 job vacancies, according to a report commissioned in October. Ms Favour says some employers had become desperate. And she says Ashburton isn't the only town in that situation, so she is thankful the government is considering regions in its new proposal.
We're pleased that those who are here have some hope that they can stay longer. We're pleased that employers who want to keep migrants here have some opportunities for improving their processes, and we're pleased that there are greater opportunities for our employers to find staff.
Under the new scheme, the essential skills and demand lists would be replaced with regional skills shortage lists. Ian Lees-Galloway says regional employers could expect a straightforward process for hiring migrants, while migrants would be given a more accurate idea of regional opportunities. He says the current system is overly complex.
So we're building one straightforward system for employer-assisted visas rather than the multitudes of different entry points that we have at the moment. There is work for employers right now, and there will continue to be work for employers, but we're building a much more streamlined, straightforward and easier system to work with.
Today's migrant visa scheme announcement comes after 4 high-profile migrant exploitation cases in just 5 months. Mr. Lees-Galloway says the government is bringing in tough tests to make sure employers are fit to hire from overseas.
If an employer does not have a good track record, they should not get approval to be able to hire migrant workers. But also by getting that better skills match, we want to make sure that people are going into real jobs where their skills are going to be used appropriately.
The plans received a nod of approval from Federated Farmers spokesperson Chris Lewis, who says New Zealand needs to appeal to the best migrant dairy workers. He says the proposed changes could also benefit existing migrant workers.
The biggest thing is giving our staff security for the future. You know, at the moment they only have a year-by-year visa, but if we can extend that, it gives them security and the confidence that they can stay here in New Zealand.
Marlon Ramos, who moved from the Philippines to work on a farm in Ashburton, agrees.
Especially the migrants like us, it's a big help, good message for us.
And Adi Avneet, who runs a newcomers network in Ashburton, says migrants have a lot to offer.
Migrants contribute to the economy. They bring new blood, fresh energy, fresh ideas, thinking outside of the box. Studies all over the world show that migrants really enrich the community they arrive to.
Ian Lees-Galloway says there is no risk of New Zealanders missing out on opportunities as a result of the changes. He says there will be more support for employers to hire locally. While the scheme is a short-term solution, he says training opportunities to channel young New Zealanders into skilled employment will be essential in the long term. Consultation is open until midway through March next year. For Checkpoint in Ashburton, ko Katie Todd, Tēnei.
A small but noisy group of protesters have vented their anger over a proposal to build an egg-producing farm in North Waikato. Mainland Poultry wants to build 6 large sheds on a rural property halfway between Taupiri and Oreni. The protesters presented a petition signed by 30,000 New Zealanders. Andrew McRae reports.
5, 6, 7, 8. This is cruelty. The hens can't wait. 5, 6, 7, 8. This is cruelty. Can't wait.
About 35 people protested outside the Waikato District Council in Ngaruawahia at lunchtime, making it clear they were against what they describe as a mega egg factory farm. Most were from the animal rights group Direct Animal Action.
I saw a truck with a lot of chickens that were really battered and no feathers, and I just felt it's cruelty, and why do people want to make animals suffer like that, and why are we being a part of it?
Merville Lang, one of a number of protesters who came down from Auckland. Paul Cohen describes himself as an animal activist. He's upset by the size of the proposed egg farm.
Apparently there's going to be 400,000 chickens. Now, if you don't know much about how we raise eggs and all that stuff, they cull them after every, I think it's 8 months, so 500,000 plus chicks have died on day one, the male chicks. So it's a very huge, cruel industry.
One local person at the protest was Nick Picknell. He lists concerns about building the egg farm on the site.
Odour, also traffic increases throughout the area, and I think for a lot of people it is just the change in lifestyle. There are a number of young families there, and they live a rural lifestyle, and now they're going to have a great block of sheds near their household. It's not right in an area like this where we have a number of native species, where we have locals who are trying to plant out the area, to then put a shed that's going to attract rats and destroy the local animals' population.
In 2014, Peter Berry successfully fought a plan by Craddock Farms to build an egg farm next to her property at Patumahoe in South Auckland. She feels for the people fighting mainland poultry.
It's absolutely David and Goliath. You know, it's the true essence of what that story is about. They can buy in 10 different experts. You know, they would have spent millions of dollars on the Craddock application and the process. Well, the ordinary person cannot do that.
Direct Animal Action's Deirdre Sims says the group's opposed to any form of what it calls industrial factory farming.
We're incredibly concerned about the types of conditions that these hens will be living in. So it will be a new sort of system. It will be a multi-tiered aviary system, which is a type of cage-free system, but we say that cage-free does not equate to cruelty-free.
Mainland Poultry says a cage-free barn system with tiered aviaries will allow chickens to freely move anywhere within the barn. The company says there'll be no cages whatsoever and animals can express their natural behaviour. It says free-range eggs cost twice as much to produce and cannot meet the demand for eggs in New Zealand in the foreseeable future. An independent commissioner has heard the company's application for resource consent and will make a decision in February. In Hamilton for Checkpoint, ko Andrew McRae-Tene.
And just returning to the story earlier in the program about Rule LaRue, who is the teenager sentenced to home detention after she killed a 15-year-old boy in a hit and run earlier this year. There's a petition underway to get that sentence reviewed, appealed. This person has got in touch saying the person who killed the young boy, when we have a government committed to reducing the prison population massively without addressing underlying causes, of course you end up seeing slaps with wet bus tickets and decriminalisation of drug-related offences. Is there a lazier way to hit their off-the-cuff targets and score political points at the same time, this person says? The only costs are further breakdown of our society and further loss of life. The other story that's grabbed your attention this evening is about Thompson and Clark, that is the private investigators who were doing work for public departments. Southern Response also. As far as I see, this person says Southern Response were just doing their job, trying to make sure the government wasn't being ripped off. Thanks for your company this evening. We will catch you tomorrow on Checkpoint.
RNZ News at 6. Ngā mihi nui, good evening, ko Katrina Batanaho. The new evidence that saw the Immigration Minister do a U-turn and reassess his decision not to deport Karel Srubeck has been released by the National Party. It's a Corrections Department recording in which Srubeck angrily calls his ex-wife from prison and berates her for not letting him read a letter she wrote in support of him remaining in New Zealand before sending it to his lawyer.
Like, do you want me to send somebody to you to talk to you because, like, you're just doing crazy stuff? Like, you promised me 2 days ago you were fine with it, and I keep my word, okay?
Karel Srubeck talking to his ex-wife from prison. National MP Mark Mitchell says they released parts of the recording today to counter claims from Srubeck that his estranged wife had not been under any threat. He says the recording clearly shows she was the victim, despite Srubeck's